Okay, Larry, what we're looking at here, disregard the word that says green side, it still applies, but we're kind of considering this in mid-wedge variables right now. The thing we're looking at in the golf club, right? We're at impact, dynamic loft, angle of attack. Those two things add up to make the spin loft number. I'm not sure how familiar you are with some of the TrackMan terms, but the spin loft is basically the difference between loft at impact and angle of attack. So how much angle is between those two things. Strike location, and then media interruption would just basically grass or water or sand between our ball, and then club head speed. So those are the things we're considering with the golf club. What that does to the golf ball, all those things are going to add up to produce a trajectory, a spin rate, a carried distance. The things you're looking at there, the smash factor would be relative to the strike, and then friction being the big one that we need to consider right now. The friction piece is why your golf ball is going too high and distance is inconsistent. Okay, so when we look at the golf club pieces, the spin loft and the speed are the two things that we are not getting into good relationships to control the distance we want. So if I have more dynamic loft, which would be a higher lofted club, and I give it the same angle of attack, so same motion, and I increase speed to the point where that spin loft can't get friction in that collision, the trajectory goes up and the spin is less. Okay, so that changes my distance number because of trajectory and spin rate. So when I'm choosing a club that at that speed is going to produce a spin loft that I cannot get consistent friction with, my distance control suffers. So what we don't want to do is pick golf clubs that are inviting that inconsistency that has nothing to do with you physically necessarily. Now, we also know that you're picking that club that has too much loft. You're needing to give it too much speed to try and get it there, which is requiring some technique changes that we don't want. So the simple answer to the mid-wedge solution of gaining some control is club choice, which is the change of dynamic loft. Okay, so when dynamic loft changes and comes down, an angle of attack stays roughly the same, our spin loft angle gets less. So at the speed that we need to hit that golf ball 75 or 80 yards, I can now get friction between my club and my ball. I can now get a little more spin because there's friction, which will bring the trajectory down. And I'm not risking losing friction to where now it may slip and go up, or it may spin and come down. And that's where the inconsistency of the distance comes from, even when the strike is nice. Okay, so it's twofold. Getting the correct dynamic loft from the correct club choice is the twofold solution, because now I don't need a whole bunch of speed and I compromise technique, but also at those speeds with less dynamic loft, I can get friction on the golf ball and control my trajectory and spin. So this is a very common question that I get among, again, every level of golfer. The educational piece here is necessary to understand that you're making club choices that are more the problem than anything. So that's more what we're looking to see. You start picking out correct club choices, and we are going to start finishing the mid-wedge puzzle. So give me a brief second. I'm going to change screens right there so you can see a reference point for one of my PGA Tour players. Hang on 1 second. Now, Larry, what we're looking at is a PGA Tour player and roughly what he does with mid wedges. And I use the verbiage that the player wants to use. I don't really care what we call it. It's just not a short game shot, and it's not a full golf swing. So this particular player just decided that it is the innate wedge motion he'd make with the rules of the movement, like we talked about in your first video, which is not really seeing pelvis and torso separate a ton, and the arms don't continue to backswing once the pelvis is done. What we measure when we've got a player in the studio or TrackMan available is we will see a club head speed associated with that movement and the club, and we find that that's extremely consistent. So the speed is extremely consistent. That's one of the variables. So if the strike is consistent and the speed is consistent, then the distance would be very consistent by nature. The distance is sort of the derivative of spin loft and speed, assuming the strike is correct. So as a reference there, I will note one thing in his club selection. If you can see that, he's got a 54 degree down to a pitch and wedge. So there's really a 2 club gap there. That matters as we start to look at this in just a moment. I'm not a big fan of his wedge setup, but because he has such a gap there, but let's understand that. So his 62 degree wedge, he's not generally gonna ever try and hit that full. That's not really a choice he makes on golf course, nor should it be. But for the sake of the science, we had him hit some full ones, and they go about 90 yards. You can see about 88 yards is what the average was. The 58 degree goes about 105. His 54 goes about 120. I think it's marked on there 118, okay? The pitch and wedge, you see a large gap there, obviously, because there's a 2 club gap. Now, when we start looking at the wedge motion, look 2 clubs down. So from his 62 full golf shot to 2 clubs down, his wedge shot, they're about the same. Look at the 54 to the pitch and wedge, and this is why I note there's a 2 club gap in there. They're about the same. Look at the pitch and wedge to the 8 iron. They're about the same. So most players make the mistake of, if you think it's your lob, almost a lob wedge full number, which was, if you're saying 80 yards, you're trying to hit your 56. Well, your lob wedge would probably, I would imagine, if you've got a 60 degree wedge, it's something that you would probably fly, maybe in the 90 ballpark, maybe 95 would be about where that's going to go. So you've gone, okay, I'll go 1 club down and still take a little off, and you've wedged yourself right in the middle of 2 techniques. You need to go 2 clubs down and make a movement that satisfies the rules of pelvis and torso staying a lot closer together and the arms not running on. So you don't lose control of the strike. But then at the speed you need with, say, a 52 degree wedge or a 54, depending on your wedge makeup, there's your 75 or 80 yard wedge shot under complete control, because you've guaranteed friction. The movement's a lot easier to control. The contact's gonna be a lot easier to control. You will consistently get the same spin and get the same trajectory, which then you're playing a single variable game, which is controlling how hard I move. So you can see in there, and I left this page up where it is intentionally, you should sort of figure out how far that flies with all your wedges down to your pitching wedge, and have those numbers. And then you see there in the practice of getting it wrong. The big thing, let me zoom in on that a little bit so maybe it's a little bit easier for you to see. There you go. The game is, once you figure out those distances, you go put a target at those distances, and you can see the rules of the game there. You're going to hit 3 shots with the same club at its given target, but you're only going to try and hit the target once. You're going to try and hit it a little long of the target the first shot. You're going to try and hit it a little short of the target on the second shot, and then you're trying to hit it right in the middle of the first 2 shots on the third. That's how we practice our touch control wedges, distance control wedges. Once we have a known distance, and that would be the very consistent club head speed through that movement, you're gonna know a distance. You're gonna have a tool within a couple of yards. Getting really good is being able to move that 4 or 5 yards up and down, which is a pretty simple task once you boil it down to club head speed alone. So that's a great reference for a PGA Tour player that had the exact same issues. You understand that the club choice affects technique, which affects the strike, but then it also affects how much speed I need at that spin loft, where we're losing control of our friction. And that's where our trajectory and our spin issues come in from. So actually pretty good with the technique on your end on this one in terms of the golf swing, but you're forcing yourself into some poor movements where you can't control the strike with club choice. So the short answer to the mid-wedge thing for you is play less loft and I think you'll see a lot more success.